Well, Claudius Lysias has Paul in a fairly secure location. He still hasn't taken him inside the fortress, but at least now he's away from the mob and surrounded by soldiers. And again, uh, Paul wanted a word with Claudius Lysias, and so he said, "May I speak to you?" And Lysias is surprised that he can speak Greek. And the reason he's surprised is because Lysias thinks that Paul is somebody else. Well, who exactly? Well, he says to him, "Are you not the Egyptian who some time ago stirred up a rebellion and led the 4,000 assassins out into the wilderness?" A few years before this, there had been the case of a self made Messiah who was probably Jewish, but living in Egypt, perhaps even grew up in Egypt. Remember, there was a large population of Jews in Egypt. And, and he had gathered 4,000 Sicarii, and the Sicarii is the word that refers to the dagger that you see there in the picture. And he was going to take these 4,000 with him and storm Jerusalem and, clean out the Romans altogether and declare himself as a Messiah and bring the Jews into some kind of a paradise. Well, the Romans put that down, but he, the Egyptian, was able to escape. And so he had been at large for a time. And so when this whole thing happened in Jerusalem, the tumult and all of that, Lysias just assumed that this Egyptian guy was back trying to stir up the crowd against the Romans. Well, he was wrong. Now, just to get our timetable right here, you can see that we are in around the year 57 or so, where you see there Paul imprisoned in Jerusalem and Caesarea. Again, these dates are not exact, but I'm just kind of giving you a basic timeline to show that we're approaching the year 60 AD. So in your notes, there is an entire timeline. This is just a part of it. You can pull that whole thing out and get your bearings there. All right. So Paul says, no. I'm a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a city of no mean or insignificant city. And I implore you, permit me to speak to the people. Now, you might think that by this time, Paul has kind of got the idea it's not going to be good to speak to the people, but he is insistent on setting the record straight. They have misinterpreted him. They misunderstand who he is and how he feels about the law, the scriptures, the temple, and Jehovah. And he really, really, really is burdened for his people. He wants to explain who he is and who Jesus is, most importantly of all. And Lysias, kind of surprisingly, gives him permission to do so. And so Paul stands on these stairs that you can see there in the picture, and he's obviously surrounded by soldiers by now, and the mob is standing out listening to what he has to say. And so in typical fashion, he motions with his hand, and finally, after so much rabble rousing and tumult, there is this calm, this great silence. And he has an opportunity to speak to them in the Hebrew language. Now, that could possibly be understood as Aramaic. Remember that in the Babylonian captivity, the people of Israel picked up Aramaic. That was the Babylonian language. It's very similar to Hebrew, kind of like Spanish and Portuguese are similar languages. But it's also possible that Paul was actually speaking to them in Hebrew. The reason I suggested Aramaic is because in the first century, Aramaic was still very common on the streets of Judea. But Paul may have actually spoken in genuine Hebrew in order to really impress the people with the fact that he was a Jew and that he did honor the people of God. And so there's the picture of the model of Jerusalem showing the stairs um, as it would have perhaps looked at that time. And Paul now has an opportunity to speak to them. And this takes us right into chapter 22. And so we'll just continue right on into the next chapter because it really, the chapter division between 21 and 22 doesn't make a whole lot of sense here, except for the fact that it kind of divides up the content a little bit. But chapter 22, Paul is there on the stairs and he says, "Brethren and fathers, hear my defense before you now." Now, brethren, obviously a reference to Jewish people, just as Paul himself is a Jew. Fathers could be referring to city leaders, perhaps the Sanhedrin members who would have been gathered there. And so he's giving a defense. And When they heard that he spoke to them in the Hebrew language, they kept all the more silent. Very interesting. Why would they? If they had known exactly who Paul was, they wouldn't have been surprised to hear him speak in the Hebrew tongue. But remember, this mob was consisting probably mostly of people that really didn't know what was going on. So they've just tried to kill a guy that speaks fluent Hebrew. And so they're wondering, whoa, who is this guy? And so he really has their attention now. And I think that's probably the reason why Paul knew that if he spoke Hebrew to them, that he would have their ears. So he says, I'm a Jew, born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city. I lived here in Jerusalem, and I studied at the feet of Gamaliel. Now remember, Gamaliel was a Pharisee who was respected like no other Pharisee had been in recent years. Remember, we talked about him back in chapter 5. He's the one that came to the rescue of the apostles when the rest of the Sanhedrin wanted to kill them. And when he died, remember, some of the Jews said that he was so important that when he died, it was as if the Torah, the law of Moses, had died with him. And again, the Jews love to use that kind of hyperbolic, exaggerated language in order to make a point. Gamaliel died around the year 50, which is right around, perhaps just after the time of the Jerusalem Council in Acts chapter 15. But Paul had studied under him. And you remember, this is around the year 57 or 8, so he's probably been dead now around 7 or 8 years. Okay, but still very, very much revered. And Paul says, I studied at his feet. I was taught according to the strictness of our father's law, the law of Moses, and I was zealous toward God, just like all of you are today. In other words, Paul is doing a really effective job of identifying here with his people. And I placed Romans 10:2 there in brackets just to draw your attention to Paul's identity with the people of God when he exhorts them in the book of Romans. And Paul says, I persecuted this way to the death. Now, did they know what the way was? Yeah. At least several in the crowd would have understood the way to be referring to this cult, this sect that we know today as the church, Christianity. But again, the way is the designation that they would have recognized. He said, I persecuted these guys. I bound them and delivered them into prisons, both men and women. And I even the high priest here bears me witness. Now, according to the historical records available to us, the high priest at this time is a man named Ananias, and we'll see that in chapter 23, the next chapter. And so he would not have been the high priest at the time that Paul was persecuting the church, but he probably was a member of the Sanhedrin at that time. And so he would have remembered Paul. And so Paul says, the high priest bears me witness, and all the council of the elders, the Sanhedrin, from whom I also received letters to the brethren, and went to Damascus to bring in chains even those who were there to Jerusalem to be punished. In other words, Paul is basically saying to them, I had the same attitude about these people that you guys have today. I understand. I was on board with you at that time. Now, here's a rendering of the leaders. Notice the governors in Judea. Pontius Pilate was governor until 36, and then there were several that didn't do very well. They didn't last very long. And then Antonius Felix and Porcius Festus, who also only served for a couple of years or so. Well, actually, Felix more like 8 or 9 years. They came later. These names in green are names that are mentioned in the book of Acts. So Pilate, Felix, and Festus are all mentioned in Acts as governors, and then you can see the high priests who are mentioned. And Caiaphas, you'll notice, was high priest until the time that Pilate was eventually removed from that office in 36 AD. But Ananias is the man who is ruling now, and he's probably near the end of his rulership as high priest. You can see he was high priest from 46 to 58, and right now we're about the year 57 or 58, so he's coming to the end of his time as high priest. Just want to give you a little bit of background there so you can kind of see again who is in what position at this stage of the game. Now, Paul is going to enter into a testimony of his conversion, and this is the second of three. The first one in chapter 9 actually tells the story of his conversion. It's the narrative. Here he recalls it in his testimony before the mob, and then later on in chapter 26, he's going to have another opportunity to share his conversion testimony before Herod Agrippa II and other leaders in Rome in the city of Caesarea. So I'm not going to repeat everything here because a lot of it is repetition, but there are some elements here that are unique to this passage. He says, "It happened as I journeyed and came near Damascus about noon." Okay, this is the only passage that tells us exactly what time. "There was a great light from heaven shone around me." And obviously it wasn't the sun, because at noon that would have been obvious. "I fell to the ground and heard a voice to me saying, 'Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?' So I answered, 'Who are you, Lord?' And he said to me, 'I am Jesus of Nazareth.'" Now remember, back at the beginning of Acts in chapter 2, chapter 3, when Peter and the apostles are ministering, they make good use of this title, Jesus of Nazareth, because the Jews despised the people of Galilee, and Nazareth was a city in Galilee. And it's just another reminder that God uses the unusual and the unexpected to accomplish his grand purposes. "And those who were with me indeed saw the light and were afraid, but they did not hear the voice of him who spoke." Now, again, back in chapter 9, Luke says that they heard a voice. So our conclusion was they heard some sort of noise, rumbling or something, but they weren't able to discern what the voice was saying. And so Paul says, "I said to him, 'What shall I do, Lord?' And the Lord said to me, 'Arise and go into Damascus, and there you will be told all the things which are appointed for you to do.'" And remember, when he gets into Damascus, he meets a man named Ananias. And since he says, "I could not see for the glory of that light, being led by the hand of those who were with me, I came into Damascus." And there's the mention of Ananias. Now, remember, there are actually three Ananiases in the book of Acts. There's Ananias and Sapphira, who lied to the Holy Spirit and were killed by the Lord back in chapter 5. There's the Ananias here in Damascus who meets Paul and lays hands on him so that he might receive his sight. And then the third Ananias is actually the high priest, who is in power at this stage, whom we'll meet in chapter 23. So Ananias in Damascus comes and meets Paul, and he refers him as brother Saul. "Receive your sight." And at that hour I looked at him, and he said, "The God of our fathers has chosen you, that you should know his will and see the just one and hear the voice of his mouth." And just one would be an Old Testament term referring to God. A lot of titles, names for God in the Old Testament, and that's one that Paul would have recognized as a reference to Jehovah. "For you will be his witness to all men of what you have seen and heard." Notice twice there the emphasis on seeing and hearing, and that's what a witness does. When Jesus said, "You will be my witnesses," back in Acts 1:8, that's what he's talking about, just sharing what we have seen and heard, what we've experienced by the grace of God. And so Ananias there in Damascus said to Paul, "Why are you waiting? Arise and be baptized and wash away your sins, calling on the name of the Lord." Again, some have said, there's a proof that baptism can actually wash away sins. But we've already made a case for this back in chapter 2. I'll simply reiterate it here. By being baptized, Paul was not being saved. Baptism cannot wash away sins, but baptism is an outward illustration of what has taken place inside. And so the rite of baptism is a way of reenacting, if you will, before a crowd of people, what God has done in the heart. So there is a sense in which being baptized washes away sins, as it tells the story. I've died with Christ, I was buried with him, I have been raised together with him to walk in newness of life. So while baptism per se doesn't wash away sins, it illustrates the washing away of sins that comes by identifying with the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. All right. Well, he he is going to find himself in Jerusalem next, and we're going to wait and talk about this when we come back to the next lecture because something very interesting happens at this point.